Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We are wrapping up today's presentations with a keynote lecture by Unit 38. We have Jamie Hignett, who is one of the partners in Unit 38. Well, it's actually a cooperative. And it's a very important lecture for us. I mean, perhaps not just because of the type of projects we are developing, especially using the model of public-common partnership, which I think Jamie and his colleagues are using a lot in their work, but also for the future of the program. Like we like to learn a lot more from practices that are politically engaged and doing a lot of work that goes beyond, let's say, the conventional approaches of architectural practices. So to understand that, I can give the floor to Jamie. So thank you very much for joining us today and giving us the time to share the work that you're developing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Actually, I think I'll just hold it, it'll be easier. So yeah, as I said, I'm Jamie from Unit 38. We're an architectural cooperative. We started working together in 2018. The photo on the side of the screen there, the Pretty Nails, was our first office, which was Unit 38 within Seven Sisters Indoor Market in Tottenham. David, my colleague, had been working with the traders for a long time. They'd been campaigning to stop the market getting demolished for nearly 15 years at that point in 2018. And Vicky, one of the traders, ran this nail salon, and she gave us the mezzanine of that space to use as an office. In the middle here are two images of the market. On the top, you can see the kind of the urban nature of this indoor market. It's historically been a department store in the kind of Edwardian era, then bought by TfL when they extended the Victoria line up through Tottenham. When TfL bought it, the department store had gone bust. It sat empty for about 20 years. And then in the late 90s, different waves of immigration into the UK brought different traders into the market, and they built their own market stalls within this place. And it kind of became kind of colloquially known by a lot of the Colombian traders as Pueblito Pasa, and kind of reflecting a lot of the kind of architectural iconography of like where they came from in Colombia. And it became this kind of amazing microcosm of the city where there were units that by day were a supermarket. So you can see in the bottom image there, we were doing a workshop with the traders. It's my colleague Ben in the T-shirt. By day it was a supermarket. By evening it was a bar and a restaurant. And by night it was a salsa bar. And they just did that by moving the furniture around. What the traders have been fighting against was the image on the left where they were wanting to flatten the market and build a kind of very generic mixed-use scheme, no affordable housing, generic commercial space. You can see in the renders it's a Pasta Express. And this was a kind of joint development, the kind of classic like PFI scheme, basically, where the land itself was owned by TfL, the surrounding land was owned by the council, and the council were in a joint venture with Granger, who are one of the UK's biggest build-to-rent landlords. They'd developed the site on the other side of the road, which used to be the library, and then they were lining up for this. The traders have been fighting to defend it for years. They'd already worked with two different sets of architects to develop a community plan, and when they asked us in 2018 to join them, they initially asked us just to resubmit the planning application that an architect had done previously. Collectively, we sort of looked at this and we thought, these people deserve a lot better than that previous planning application. This is an amazing opportunity, but also here and kind of in so many of the projects we now do, architecture is just kind of a tool for the community organising and the political action that is needed to make these projects realised. But the architecture sort of gives it this legitimacy that otherwise it wouldn't have. So here are some more of the recent images that we produced for a lot of the engagement materials. On the left is the old department store building, kind of refurbished, and on the right is the refurbished market hall. refurbishing the upper floors that have been empty ever since TfL bought the building, so the market was just operating on the ground floor. And here are some images of what that corner building would be. So the idea of the community plan was to reopen the ground floor as the market, extend the market up into the first floor that had been empty, create new small business space on the second floor, and then that corner building, the very iconic corner building that sits on that very important junction just above the tube station, would be for community uses. So some form of anchor tenant on the ground floor, and then community space above that could be used for kind of big public meetings, like shown in the image on the right. And this morning there's already been quite a bit of discussion about kind of public commons partnerships, and in a way the first kind of thinking about public commons partnerships by particularly like Bertie Russell and Keir Milburn was developed through this Wards Corner community plan. So the idea is this community benefit society that's now been set up is a collection of traders, local residents, other kind of specialists, that they would take on the lease of the building, a long, like stable lease from Transport for London that actually own the land. And then that would also be influenced by the Seven Sisters Market tenant, the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. And then the CBS is a democratic organisation that local residents and traders can join as members. You can also kind of buy shares and invest, but it's very democratic and horizontal in the fact that no matter how much you invest, it's one member, one vote. This is a diagram that my colleague David recently drew, because I think it's very interesting seeing a lot of these diagrams this morning in a lot of student presentations. And I think, this is the kind of ideal nature of it, that it's quite simple transactions that are financial or governance or management or responsibility. But I think David sort of produced this diagram to understand the actual relationships needed to try and make this project a reality, especially going from a place where it's been resisting a big private development for so long to transforming into a productive relationship with Transport for London and actually shifting from campaigning to actually managing an existing space. So as well as all the organisations in the previous diagram, there's all the different kind of political bodies, local campaign groups, the media, and other different kind of organisations used to kind of leverage the power to try and kind of rebalance the power imbalance between a small group of kind of immigrant market traders in Tottenham and the UK's largest build-to-rent developer. So as I said, in 2018, we spent about 6 months kind of redesigning the community plan with the traders, doing a lot of events. But really what most of our time has been on over the last 6 years now has been the kind of political organising around making the project a reality. So on the left is a big street demo that happened outside TfL's offices, I think in 2019. And then the image on the right was a big community meeting in Tottenham in 2019. I think we had over 100 people in the room to talk about the future of this plan and kind of build support around it. And, this is just a very small snapshot of all the protesting, all the lobbying, all the community organising that's happened. But as well as that, also a lot of the community organising has been organising the family fiestas, which on the right are these amazing weekend events, kind of free activities for local children. And on the left was a fundraiser back in 2018 at Grow Tottenham, which is sadly no longer there, with this amazing gentrification piñata getting smashed apart by the kids. And if you want to kind of read a bit more of a kind of personal history of the market, again, my colleague David has been doing a lot of work with migrants and culture, and he interviewed a lot of people around the market and produced this bit of writing. If you go on our website, on our homepage, you can find a link to it and read it. And it's kind of David's reflections of himself being a Colombian migrant, the importance of this space to the Latin American community in London and the different stories that sort of weave through that space. So that project is ongoing. The CBS is now the preferential bidder on the lease for the market. There's ongoing work with TfL to try and secure that lease. But it will probably still be another few years before the market ever reopens. The next project I wanted to talk about is Pelican House, which is where we're based in Bethnal Green. And in a way, the kind of project came about because of our learnings and ways of operating from Tottenham, from Ward's Corner. So in 2020, us and a collection of about 12 different organisations, different kind of tenants' unions, the London Renters Union, United Voices of the World, the Union, Autonomy, the think tank, and a few other organisations came together to rent about half of the space in Pelican House. We were there for about 2 or 3 years before we were then going to get evicted by the management company. And we decided, instead of moving on and finding another space, the building was so ideal for us scenarios that we set up the Pelican Collective, which is a kind of non-profit cooperative of all the organisations in the building. And we decided to take on the lease for the entire building. We've now been running it for about a year and a half. So this diagram kind of shows the Pelican Collective is this democratic organisation. Once a month, all the different residents of Pelican House meet to kind of discuss the big decisions in the forum. It has all these different subcommittees that manage operations and outreach and programming. And then the kind of relationships between us, the building owner, the council, and different funders. So going from 2020 and being about 12 different organisations in the building, we are now over 40 organisations. The building's kind of completely fully let. We've recently made a load of refurbishments last summer. And these are 2 short videos that I'll just kind of play in the background while I talk, which are a kind of summary of the last year and a half of the building and the management of the space. And in kind of putting these together, I think it's just to show the kind of like diversity of activity that happens in this space. So we have this big event space, which gets used for training, for conferences, for parties, for fundraisers. We organise community meals, particularly we organise a lot of community iftars, and then recently been organising a lot of community meals for refugees and asylum seekers that are based in the hotels around Whitechapel. And then this video on the right here is from the Unit 38 summer party, where we had another giant piñata. It's kind of our favourite thing to do for parties. We've recently opened a makerspace above the event space as well that can be used for making banners, making props for protests, things like that. We have the yard, we have gardening clubs. Scarlet Letters recently moved in. There's a bookshop on the ground floor. And here are some good photos from our Christmas party. I think that's enough of that. So the drawing on the left is a diagram of Pelican House. We have this big yard and event space at the back. We have a common room on the second floor. And throughout the year, the space is used by all different types of groups, because the kind of economic model of the space is that the rent of the tenant organisations means that all the communal spaces don't need to generate any income. So local community groups, grassroots campaigns, organisers can use that space completely free of charge, or it's just kind of on a donation basis. As I said, the space is kind of run democratically. In the image in the middle here is our all-resident meeting from last summer, where we decided to become a social centre and sort of reorientate the surpluses generated within the building to focus more on that. And again, this is just a selection of all the different kind of activities and events that happen here, from the community meals on the left, and these are some of our friends from the hotels cooking, community iftar, meal in the middle, making banners for protests on the right, Latin American folk dancing in the common room, and our own parties down in the event space. And here is some of the flyers from all the different kind of events that happen. But obviously, like, a big part of this that's kind of all the visible work of managing a space. The actual reality is it's a huge amount of maintenance. You know, we're working in a building that was in managed decline for years. The landowner wanted to knock it down. The roof leaks. And I kind of always joke that I think every architect should have to be responsible for fixing a leaky roof before they get to design anything. I think you learn so much about, like, the kind of care and repair that is needed in working with existing buildings, and from my own experience in working in lots of practices, is just not thought about in early design stages. So if you want to know more about this, we've recently finally got an online presence. We have a website. You can go to pelicanhouse.org. We've got Instagram, and you can kind of support all the work we do there and see upcoming events, and hopefully we can see some of you down there. And then I'm going to just talk about 3 more projects that are all quite similar in extent, kind of different scales, but all working with housing organisations. And in a way, these projects wouldn't really happen without Pelican House existing, because in that building we have London Renters Union and we have MedAct, who are kind of campaigning organisation of medical professionals, so campaigning around health issues, currently doing a lot of work around the health impacts of poor housing, of damp and mould, and too cold housing. So on the left here is Evelyn Court. It's an estate in Hackney, just next to Hackney Downs Park. And on the right is College Bank, also kind of colloquially known as Seven Sisters, which is very amazing serendipity that where we started in Tottenham is also colloquially known as Seven Sisters, but here the Seven Towers are called Seven Sisters. It's in Rochdale on the outskirts of Manchester. These are some of the residents that live at College Bank, and they were fighting for years to stop these towers getting demolished. They were built by the council, then transferred to a new housing association called Rochdale Borough-Wide Housing, that interestingly is actually a cooperative. They have residents on their board, but they're also the housing association that managed the estate on the other side of Rochdale where Awab Ishaq lived. I'm not sure if everyone knows about Awab Ishaq. He was a young boy, 2 years old, who died from the black mold in his flat, and this was after like repeatedly reporting it to the housing association and them doing nothing about it. And you know, the inquiry into his death has led to a new law that's named after Awab, to try and force housing associations to better address mold in their properties. You know, these residents were fighting to save the towers from demolition, again, much like in Tottenham, where the housing association were trying to bring in more private finance, so knocking down all this social housing, building new blocks that would be the majority private rental or for sale. And most of these residents have lived here the majority of their life. There's a real need for social housing in Rochdale, and it's just kind of criminal that they were trying to knock this stuff down. Over the last year, we've been doing a lot of workshops with them. You know, it's a huge estate. Even though they started decanting it, because the demolition looked like it was going to go ahead, so now it's about half empty. There's still hundreds of residents there. And there's also Lower Phalange, which this image on the left here is a neighbouring estate, but it's all low-rise. Both estates have the same problems. They're like system-built, post-war housing, no insulation, really bad repairs, and it's causing like huge amount of health problems with people living here. You can see this quote from one of the residents whose son nearly died from the black mold and damp in their bedroom. we were going up there about once a month to run workshops for residents, and the point of this was to develop a brief for how to retrofit the towers with the residents. So the housing association, kind of following the kind of the inquiry into Awab's death, had kind of promised that they were going to retrofit these towers. They were in discussions with Legal in General, the big pension fund, to fund it. So what we were trying to do is develop a brief with the residents that could inform all of this work that normally happens behind closed doors, when it's, you know, it's hundreds of millions of pounds being discussed in terms of like a big estate retrofit. And collectively, we kind of mapped out the estate, mapped out their experiences, their stories, what they want to see improved, what they actually really love and want to keep, and kind of developed these different bulletins and demands. This is a poster, but there's a huge kind of 80-page report that summarises all of this that we've presented to the Housing Association. And again, it's about that sort of redressing the power imbalance between a group of social housing residents and like a pension fund and a big housing association that historically has treated their residents really poorly. And unfortunately, they will listen to a professional like me that has a qualification over the residents, even though really what we're doing in this process is really just translating what the residents are saying into a written report. And then Evelyn Court. So these next two, I think, are quite interesting, where the residents have been campaigning for a long time for improvements. They had a lot of really bad damp and mould on the estate. And here they've been working with solicitors on a big housing disrepair claim. And London Rents Union have been helping them organise protests, and MedAct had been doing a lot of research on the health impacts of this. And then we were brought in to kind of do a lot of workshops to residents about damp and mould, why it's formed, what are the ways to resolve it. This is a lot of the residents outside of IDS, which is the Housing Association's offices, demanding big protests. And over the last few years, like, all of their protests has led to like millions of pounds of investment in these properties. The issues still aren't fixed, but things are kind of slowly changing in their favour. On the left is workshops we've run with the residents. On the right is an image of the estate. It's a really fascinating estate because it was built by the Industrial Dwelling Society in the 1930s, and it's kind of really pioneering concrete frame construction, but solid walls, no insulation, really overcrowded, really bad damp and mould across the estate. So we've kind of been creating kind of all these kind of different educational resources for residents to explain to them the kind of like building physics behind things. I'm actually a qualified like passive house designer as well, and that kind of like building physics that you get from a kind of passive house course, I've kind of like reinterpreted into a way for residents to understand. And I think what was really interesting was the first time I ever presented this to these residents, Evelyn Court, I was quite worried that this was going to be like incredibly dry, maybe too technical. But, you know, I think it just reinforces our belief that like actually no one knows the building better than the people that live in it. No one knows the neighbourhood better than the people that live in it. And when explaining what was causing the damp and mould in people's homes, this woman next to me burst into tears because no one had ever explained it to her before. No one in the Housing Association had either taken the time to explain it to her, or to be honest, they probably didn't even know themselves. And yeah, it's incredibly kind of emotionally demanding on people to live in such poor housing. We did a lot of workshops with the kids on the estate. We also went around to people's houses with thermal imaging cameras. And again, what this showed was it just reinforced the knowledge that people already had. Like, they already knew where the drafts were coming from. They knew where there wasn't insulation. They knew where there was damp in the walls. And the thermal imaging cameras just reinforced that. And I think it really helps residents when, you know, they're basically being gaslit by their landlords, and we can kind of give them the kind of technical knowledge to show that their lived experience is correct and is right. together with them, we developed lots of proposals for how to insulate the homes. But I think also a real big thing that came from talking to a lot of the residents was a lot of them are elderly, have disabled partners, disabled family members, and these are kind of 5-6 story blocks of flats with no lifts. There's no level access into any of the flats, even the ground floor ones. And a lot of people, therefore, are like trapped in their homes. So the idea in these drawings was to illustrate like insulating the homes, but also improving the circulation, giving people outdoor space to dry their clothes as well. You know, at the moment, everyone washes their clothes in the house. A family with 4 kids, and then they have to dry the clothes in the flat as well. Like, it's kind of no wonder there's so much damp and mold. And again, these were kind of, all of this information was turned into different bulletins and leaflets that were distributed across the estate, and always kind of showing kind of concrete examples where this stuff has already happened. So when they're speaking with the housing association and they say this stuff isn't possible, they can point to all these examples where it's been done across Europe and in the UK as well. And then the final project I'm going to talk about is a much smaller estate, but I think one we've been a bit more kind of intimately involved in, and also it is now in the process of the council's got the money to insulate the homes, and we've sort of shifted again from kind of campaigning to sort of being a bit more like kind of technical steer to make sure that what the council does on the homes fits with what the residents want, and also just doesn't fail, because I mean I think there's been so many examples of like poor retrofit done across the country, and I think the way we started working with a lot more of these solicitors that do these housing disrepair claims. So they do these collective disrepair claims that are sort of built on this legislation on the left, and basically, you know, we have a legal system in this country that's so pro-landlord, but there are a few mechanisms where if you have really bad damp and mold, you have water ingress, you have kind of disrepair, that you can get damages and you can force the landlord to make changes to bring it up to be fit for human habitation. And then there's always this legal battle over what that actually means. And then on the right, you have councils talking about their net zero policies, about climate agreements, and all these things. And I think there's a real difference between these two things where they should be joined up, where, you know, the reason the homes are getting damp and mold is because they're not insulated and people can't afford their heating. And for us to achieve net zero in this country, the way we heat our homes is one of the most important things for us to address. And there should be a lot more joined up thinking. And unfortunately, the only way a lot of these residents are found to force their landlords to make these kind of changes is by sort of dragging them through the courts. So this is a small estate in Harrow called Bancroft Gardens. I'm actually going there tonight to meet the residents again. Hopefully the installation works will be starting quite soon. They're really interesting houses. They're this all-lit prefab system that's kind of post-war prefab concrete system. And we meet in the kind of small community centre next door, and again do a lot of workshops with the residents, explaining these principles to them, explaining kind of like what avenues they have for amending these things. We also, because it's council-owned rather than housing association, spend a lot of time kind of explaining different legislation to them, how they can kind of use that to leverage more information out of the contractors and out of the council. And we also actually did some kind of quite quick and slightly sketchy PHPP modelling, which is like the energy modelling for passive house. So, you know, these are the existing buildings that are just solid concrete walls, no insulation, huge amount of heat loss through the walls and through the roof. And I think what's interesting, the difficult thing sometimes with this kind of energy modelling is it's based on a constant internal temperature of 20 degrees. Obviously, no one lives like that. So, you know, the estimated heating bills here of like £3,000 to £5,000 would be how much you'd have to spend to keep that home warm, constantly warm at 20 degrees. people don't live like that. They spend a lot less. It's constantly a lot colder inside, and that's kind of where the damp and mold comes from. But what I think is really useful about this energy modeling software is that really the way to communicate this stuff isn't about carbon savings, it isn't about kilowatts, it isn't about pass-out standards, it's about heating bills. And, the level of fuel poverty in this country is so huge, the costs to the NHS are so huge because of poor housing. And it would have real huge impacts on people's lives insulating these homes. So we ran through these different models with them of different levels of insulation, different levels of air tightness, and kind of showing the potential savings of those different things. So yeah, I thought I'd just finish the presentation on these two quotes from residents in Rochdale, because I think they kind of quite succinctly summarize the work we do. And I think particularly the quote on the left where it says, let's change all of that and make it an area where people want to live and be proud of their surroundings. And that idea of pride in people's neighbourhoods comes up a lot when we're doing workshops with residents. They love where they live. They love the people they live with. They love where they call home, but the buildings themselves are really failing them, and the urban environment is really failing them. So yeah, thank you. Well, I think we've got time for some questions.
15 minutes. If anyone wants to ask questions or make any comments.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Amazing work. I had a question about the PCPs. I know one of the functions of a PCP is to use the surplus to finance new PCPs. And you touched on the sort of messy reality of some of their organizational structures. So when you're obviously the financing is probably the simple bit, but if you're trying to transfer some of the knowledge and that messy reality about the organization to a new PCP, how does that work? Do they have a standardized structure, or is each one bespoke? I guess what I'm really getting at is what sort of bureaucratic load is involved in setting up a new one.
Yeah, I think because in a way, Wards Corner's been the sort of first example of that. It's a difficult process, and also a lot of this community organising requires a huge amount of volunteer time. We weren't paid for the first year that we worked on that project really, or that much since either. I think. And that's kind of where Keir and Bertie and the people from Abundance have sort of tried to kind of do the more intellectual labour of understanding what the similarities are between these different projects, because Climavore, the oyster farming in Skye as a PCP model is very different to running a big indoor market in central London. But there's similarities, and I guess the important things are those institutions being democratic, and also there being a sort of commoning body that is slightly separate from that can redistribute that surplus. So the idea with Wards Corner in the PCP model is that it's not the Community Benefit Society that is involved in the day-to-day running of the building that is responsible for redistributing that surplus, to kind of try and separate that, because I think it's something you see a lot in housing co-ops, in a lot of these kind of more democratic ownership structures where people have a self-interest then in lowering their rent well below market value, which then means there isn't a surplus, which means they can't reinvest in the building for maintenance, and they also can't reinvest in other projects. And we've tried to that's tried to be incorporated into Wards Corner through the Community Benefit Society's structure. And a lot of the workshops we did in 2023 were with the kind of wider community discussing we'd done some financial modelling. When the market's up and running, it could be generating a surplus of £1 million a year. What should that be spent on, and how should that be reinvested locally?
Hello.
There was a question.
Thanks for your presentation. It was really good. I just have a question about ownership. I guess it sort of flows from the previous question. Back in the 80s, then Prince, now King Charles, championed what he called community architecture. There's some projects I visited up in Manchester and Liverpool, similar housing estates and everything else. And the idea behind that was to actually find financial mechanisms for people to own their own units. And that sort of accelerated the pride of ownership that you talked about in your last slide, basically. So is there thought being given to different ways to actually create ownership on the part of individuals so that they actually own as opposed to just they're at the will of local governments? I'm just not quite sure what the structure is these days.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of this thinking around public commons partnerships has come from, where there's a certain kind of left-wing trend to just think that like the state is like benevolent and good and private is bad. And you know, the example in Tottenham was the redevelopment of the market was a joint venture between the council and this developer. Like it wasn't just the developer being the one trying to evict these people, it was also the council. And the idea of these kind of like commoning organisations is that it's a kind of different form of public ownership that isn't the state. And I guess, you know, then members of the Community Benefit Society would have ownership in that market in the lease. You know, they could buy shares in it. You know, they could get invested. They could get a return on that as an owner. By investing more, you wouldn't get more say in it, but you might get more return out of it. And so I guess it's a bit of a different model of ownership where it's not like kind of outright private ownership, but it's also like not conceding everything to the state either.
I think, yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions. Maybe I'll start with something that is more related to your presentation and is maybe related to the previous two questions, which is, are there any, or is it part of the conversations around the retrofitting the public common partnership model, like putting together the two parts of your presentation?
Yeah. It's something I've talked to Keir quite a lot about, and I think we struggle slightly to see how those two things combine. I think the way maybe that it works, and I think this is something that we've explored quite a bit in Rochdale, I think particularly because it's like a housing association that by name is a cooperative, but like by practice it isn't very cooperative. And how, you know, all of these estates used to have really strong tenants and residents associations, which basically were this kind of like civil society, common, like slightly more like common organisation that's just been kind of like slowly eroded and lost over the last few decades. And actually, kind of reinstating better governance by the residents themselves on these estates could be a way to ensure kind of better management and care and maintenance going forward as well. Because I think when we're talking about the retrofit, we're always quite keen to say, you know, this will be a couple of years of them doing all this construction work, but then actually what's going to happen afterwards? Because the story of the last like 40 years of these estates is they've all just gone into decline, and how can we make sure that the maintenance that's required is done to make sure that all the good work of retrofit isn't just undone 10 years later by the fact that no one's cleaned the gutters and no one's replaced like broken weatherproofing and stuff like that. So I think it doesn't quite fit into the PC, like the kind of like pure PCP model, but I think something we're trying to explore is how there can be more resident-led decision-making in those processes.
I have a second, more general question, because in the context of the presentations by the Landscape Urbanism program, lately we've experienced, like increasingly, like during juries, that sometimes we get asked, or a student's thesis get asked, but where is the project? Where is the design? No? And something that I admire about Unit 38 is that you make a project, like in the deepest sense, even from the place where you work, like with the Pelican House and the Words Corner project, and you make a project out of things that are often ignored, like the maintenance, the management, the care, and I find that like very inspirational. So my more general question is like, how or what would you recommend to the recent graduates today, like in the future practice from your experience struggling through all these projects or having to make a project out of like the place, the physical place where you work?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, that's it's why it's useful doing these talks, because you get to like sit back and reflect a bit. You know, last 2 years we've just been so head down on all these projects. But I think we've become very good at being very like kind of lean and nimble, and like saying kind of making a project out of nothing. Like Pelican House, we started with no money basically, and sort of as we've built it and as we've kind of like let out more space, we can then kind of like slowly incrementally improve things and adapt things and make projects out of I guess what could be quite boring like maintenance regimes. There's still a lot of creative potential in them. Like last summer we had these like glass pendants in the event space of Pelican House, and they kept getting smashed because it's quite an anarchic space. A lot of different people use the space. They use it for all sorts of different types of activities. There's always someone carrying a stepladder through the space, and they kept getting smashed. And then they'd gone out of production, so we couldn't buy them anymore. So we were like, oh, we have to replace all the lights. And we thought, rather than just buying another off-the-shelf thing that also might potentially go out of business, will also break easily, we ended up designing our own lights, which you might have seen in the video. We also then made them like DMX controllable, and we can just reproduce them. So as they break, we can just fix them ourselves rather than relying on a product that we buy that's probably made in not very great conditions somewhere as well. So I think like, you know, that thing of just the frustration of people smashing light pendants actually became this like really kind of creative opportunity to make a project. And in the end, those new light fittings that we've made and designed ourselves are cheaper for us now than buying something off the shelf as well. So it's kind of like the economic imperative of like designing within very little, very few means.
Well, okay, if there is no more questions or comments, well, thank you very much, Jamie, for the lecture today, and thank you also for the students' presentations. I think it's been a very interesting morning, no, to learn your comments, your feedback, and also your work at Unit 38. Thank you very much, everyone.